Thank you all for coming back to day 3 of the lecture series, The Biblical Foundations of Free Speech. Today in our discussion, I want to look at language, the final pillar that establishes our modern notion of free speech and props it up. But before we're able to get into language, let's go back and review what we've established. So from day 1, what did we discuss? The metaphysical primacy of the individual, above the group, above the state. We established that there's a realm and a domain of conscience, that Christ grounded the individual in it, and it laid us all on equal footing. Now on day 2, what we did is we took a look at truth. And we examined how truth works in relation to the individual and what it means for our society at large, how we converse with one another, and truth as something absolute and transcendent of the individual. And today what I want to do is I want to look at language and the function of language, and how language, we categorically assume it to be a means toward truth from the individual. And the way that I want to do that is by looking at language through 2 schools of thought. Okay? And we're going to look at what they agree on. And then we're going to take it in a psychological and a political realm. And I think it's really important. On day 1, we talked about how what I'm doing here is I'm not answering questions. I'm not raising questions. Or I'm raising questions. I'm not answering them. And I think it's so much more important that we raise the right questions and talk through them than to give an answer. So the 2 questions I want us to raise and think about today are, first, is language something that is beyond itself? When we use language, are we using and bound by mere words, or perhaps are we hitting something at beyond it? Is there a metaphysical domain that we can tap into? And the second question builds upon that. It is that to the degree to which language does not represent reality, how much trouble are we in? And when we go there, we're going to take that in the level of psychology and in the level of politics. But let's begin by understanding what language is. So if we were to look at language from a purely material substrate, language is sound waves, right, that is echoed across, and it's picked up by other listeners. And language was spoken way before it was written, right? So written language does, when you're reading something, you're picking up on a symbol that tells your brain a certain sound wave. And human societies and cultures and what languages do is they ascribe significance onto the sound waves, right? And there's something in the Judeo-Christian framework that's interesting because it doesn't give a systematic account of language. Like, yes, there's the story of the Tower of Babel, where we hear about the multiplicity of language and how that happened, but the biblical thinkers clearly suggest that there's something foundational about language. And for instance, James. So James is Jesus' half-brother on this earth. And James wrote a shorter letter. It's a very potent letter. And in James 3, he talks about the tongue, right? And what he says is you can picture a boat, right? And a boat is pushed by tons of men. And it's massive, and the winds move it, and there's all these different confounding variables that affect the boat. But what guides its direction? The rudder. The rudder is the tongue. The rudder is language. And his point, he even makes this line, he says, if a man could control his tongue, he would be perfect. There's a certain significance tied to our linguistic capacity. It says that life and death is in the tongue. Derek Prince, who's this 20th century somewhat of an evangelist in the Christian faith, but he's not just an evangelist. He was a Cambridge scholar, brilliant man, and he basically, part of his message was actually, I'm going to figure out how to talk in a brilliant manner and make sense to everyone, right? And we're actually going to talk about a little bit of that concept later. But one thing Derek Prince pointed out was when he was in World War II, he was a medic in North Africa, and the man he worked with, they would go every morning, and he would teach them how to check on the patients. And you think about it, these doctors are dealing with plenty of wounded men day in and day out. And he would go and he would ask them 2 questions. He would say, how are you feeling? They give him the answer. And then he said, let me see your tongue. And he'd ask them to see their tongue. And they go, eh. And he would look at their tongue. And from the tongue, he could infer the state of their health better than any part of their body. And I think that's the same. Orwell makes this argument and I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's okay for the time being, in his essay, Politics in the English Language, that you can tell the state of a nation by what their language looks like. And he says before Russia collapsed into Stalinism, before Germany collapsed into Nazism, their language was in shambles, right? And we're going to explore this point and what it means. So now let's understand the two different schools of thought in terms of language. And part of the reason I want to draw these two schools of thought is because Caleb Knox as an individual, I am not yet sure where I land. I think there's a lot more nuance to this than we give it credit for, but I'm going to paint a dichotomy as best as I can to show that there's two ways we can think through this. And the first one is known as a realist perspective. And the realist perspective is that our words can touch reality, right? And this might be the hardest day in terms of what we're articulating, because it's a very confusing idea. But it's essentially that when you speak of something such as a tree, are you just speaking of the categorical representation, the idea of a tree, or do your words actually manifest as a tree itself? And then you can think of this in the moral domain, and that's more where I'm going to focus on, is when you're saying a word and you're saying a phrase, does it actually take on significance, or is it just the mere combustion of sound waves, right? So the realist perspective is the Christian perspective, right? And I do want to point out there was more nuance to this. For instance, this is a long theological debate that's been happening. The first century, the church. So the church had all these questions to answer in the first century, and there's all these debates that went on. And one of them was this idea. And there's a gentleman's name by he's known in history now as Euonymus IV, who basically said, look, language, he coined this phrase in their language, but it was linguistic universalism. And he said that we can use words to describe meaning, the same idea. And then there was a Christian thinker by the name of Gregory of Nyssa, and his idea was that, no, you can't. Words are relative. Words are bound by today. So even within the Christian lineage, there's more nuance there. And then, you look in the 16th century, what happened then? Basically, we found out that there's all these indigenous lands, and the Catholic Church is going out and ministering to all these indigenous populations. And what they found out is, like the story with the chair we told yesterday, they didn't have words for a lot of the key doctrines of Christianity. So the problem, it rekindled the debate. They're like, wait a minute. Some places don't have the linguistic capacity to express Christianity. What do we do then? So it's a fair question to ask. But we're going to go ahead and try to work through it. So let's start with creation, right? Mark T. Mitchell, we referenced his book yesterday. He's a professor from Patrick Henry. He wrote this book, Power and Purity. And we're going to be going back to Nietzsche's ideas a lot. And his book does a great job of looking through Nietzsche's claims and how they apply today. But what he points out once again is that, so how did God create the world? Right? He said, it's through the word. Right? He spoke it into existence. And then he creates humans. And what's the first job humans have? It's to name the animals. Right? And there's something in there, there's an embedded idea in there that to use the function of speech is to almost take on some divine role. And that when God spoke, the cosmos formed, you formed. And that when you spoke and named the animals, they took on significance. And it's like, you can even think about it in like relationship, right? Think about, so Carl Jung conceptualized marriage as a psychological relationship. And what he pointed out was, if you don't point out a problem, it's almost as if it doesn't exist, right? You can play that game for a while, but at some point you have to speak the problem into existence so you can take care of it, right? And what are we doing today as a culture on some level? It's like, speech is offensive. We can't talk about that. Well, yeah, fair enough. Like, we have real problems and they are offensive. If you've ever been in a serious relationship with someone, I'm not just talking about in a romantic manner. You have offensive conversations. Why? Because you have real problems that you got to work through. And if you can't have a conversation without offending people, then you can't go anywhere. And if you think that speech is what crafted the world and everything in it, well then of course it's offensive. It's a powerful tool, right? And then what happened? How did humanity fall apart? What was the devil's claim? The devil came down and he said, did God really say that you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What does he try to do? He wedges a gap in between language and what is real. He says, wait a second. I know God said this, but did he really mean that? So early on, they're quick to point out that watch your back if your languages don't match up with what is real anymore. And I think that, so now we've understood the creation narrative. Let's go to John 1. So John 1 is the fourth gospel. And John is essentially trying to explain to people that Jesus is the Son of God. And he opens it up with this very poetic and almost philosophical prose about Jesus. And we're going to go ahead and read it. And keep in mind, it's a parallel to the creation story in Genesis 1. So you think of Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Right? So now we're going to go and look at John 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What I'm going to try to do now might be the hardest thing I've had to explain thus far, but I'm going to do the best that I possibly can. What it's essentially suggesting is that maybe beyond the fact that your words can touch the most basic layer of reality, maybe the most basic layer of reality is language. It says, in the beginning was the Word. And what that means is that there is an order to the universe that exists beyond what humans place on it. And this is a huge point, right? I want to repeat that another time so we understand it. There's order in the universe that humans just don't place on it, right? And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but that's okay. What is the postmodern claim? So, let's bear this in mind. There's a million different ways you can view the universe, right? You can view it in as many different ways as you want. And the postmodernist says that none of them are true. There's no such thing as truth. So any way that you choose to view the universe is an order that you impose upon it. It's power. But what God is saying is, wait a minute, that's not exactly true. There is an order that exists in the universe. It's the Word. And when you speak the truth, what are you doing? You're falling in line with the reality that God set up. And we talked about truth yesterday, and it's like, I think you can build a rational case as to why truth doesn't exist. But I'm not sure you can make a case against the lies not existing. I think at some point we've all told a lie, and we know it. Right? And what does that mean to tell a lie? It's essentially saying that what you said doesn't match up with the reality that has been created. And to lie is essentially to put your own order upon life. Right? It says that in him all things were made. That's the world. That's the reality that we live in. It's not an order that we simply impose. Right? It was there. Christ placed it there. And so the categories of truth and lie aren't categories that humans invent. Truth is what lines up with the Word. A falsehood is what doesn't. And he draws this distinction with the Word that there's light and there is darkness. To tell the truth is to walk in the light. To tell a lie is to stumble in darkness. We looked at a verse yesterday also from John that said, the narrow and the wide gate, or actually that was from Matthew. And it talks about how there's this narrow gate, right? And the narrow gate is the truth, and the wide gate is the falsehood. And what your words do is they essentially can line up with the Word, that divine layer of reality, or they can deviate into the broad road, in a sense. And I think part of the idea of Christian uniqueness is, so we talked about day one, this point that Ravi Zacharias makes, that when you do the comparative analysis with Jesus and other religions, what does Jesus do? Jesus isn't as simple as, hey, by the way, here's some sacred texts we can look at. He's not saying look to the Quran, or like Buddha said, look to the Noble Truths. He's saying, no, I want to come in and I desire an intimate relationship with you. So now you can think about this. The Word, in the beginning was the Word, and he was with God, and he was God. That's Jesus. Jesus is the Word. So the idea that we get from John 1 is that language is surely beyond itself. It is the basic backdrop of reality itself, or at least the embodied form of language. And Ravi Zacharias, who's probably the most prominent apologetic of our time, makes this comparative analysis with other religions. And what he did, he was someone who grew up in the East, in India. And he had this conversion after he had an attempted suicide at age 16. And he said that Christ came in and changed his life. And he went from bottom of his class to the brightest kid among his peers. And one thing Ravi Zacharias pointed out was that the argument that I actually made the first day, which is that when you look at Jesus stacked up with other religions, what do you come across? It's that Jesus isn't just pointing you to a set of rules, a set of truths, a set of sacred texts. He's saying, wait a minute, I desire an intimate relationship with you. So to live in a relationship with Christ is to be in the truth, because you're abiding with the most basic structure reality that there is. These 5 verses go deeper than any philosopher has ever gone in a metaphysical domain. And I'm not saying that in a trivial manner. And in fact, I'm getting ahead of myself again, but Jacques Derrida, who's one of the most prominent postmodern thinkers, coined this phrase, well actually he didn't coin it, but he used the phrase foul logocentrism. And it was an originally critique used by a different psychoanalyst against Freud. But the claim is that the West predicated their entire existence upon these words, the logos. Logos is the Greek word for word, right? And in the English, it kind of dilutes it because we're just saying in the beginning was the word. But to the people who are reading this originally, and see, once again, we're getting into the nuance of language, right? When we look at it in English, it's a little bit impaired. So this is why I'm still having to think through this stuff, but you can put that aside for now. When the Greeks saw this word, they saw the word logos. Logos to them was what gave the universe meaning. It was not God, but whatever the basic structure of reality was. And because of Plato believed that words touch reality. Plato is in line with the realist school of thought. And so when we look at this verse, and what we're seeing is that it goes deeper than ever. And back to the foul logocentro point, foul logocentrism. What Jacques Derrida is critiquing is he's critiquing language. And he says what the West did wrong is they predicated their entire existence upon these verses. It's not as simple as upon Jesus. I mean, that's the main tenet. But I don't know if you can go deeper than that, but if you can, they went deeper than that. They said that the individual can live in line with the divine order. That's not an easy burden to carry. And so that's the fundamental tenet of the West that we're dealing with right now. Is order itself something that humans manufacture and impose? Or is it something far more deep that language constitutes? But now we can look at the other school of thought that we've already gotten into, and that's the nominalist. So what's the nominalist claim? The nominalist claim is far different. It says, no, well, language can't exactly touch itself, right? It's bound by its thoughts. Nietzsche has this line where he says, we can't think beyond the prison house of language, which I think is true, but his point is deeper. His point is that language can't even go beyond itself, right? And I want to look at a quote from Nietzsche, and it's only one line, and Nietzsche at one point said, I can write in a line what takes people to a book to write. And this is one of those examples. It's one of the most brilliant one-liners I've come across, and I've had to read it again and again and try to understand its deepest lane. But we're going to unpack it to the best of our ability. So in his work, Twilight of the Idols, which is a critique of Christianity, he says, I'm afraid we're not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. I'm afraid we're not yet rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. Noam Chomsky is probably the most prominent linguistic thinker of the 20th century. And part of his theory was there's 26 letters, right? What is the function of grammar? Grammar is an order that we impose upon that backdrop to make sense of it, right? It's an order that humans impose. That's key. So when you can think about it, when you look at the 26 letters, you can think about that as something akin to the basic structure of reality. What's the postmodern claim? There's a million ways you can interpret that. technically true? Yes. So to the postmodern thinker, any way in which you organize it isn't predicated upon truth. It's predicated upon power, right? Because the Christian idea is the word, the language, is something divine. It's something that transcends us. But the postmodern thinker says, no, it doesn't. There's no divine layer of reality. Anything that we think of as reality is a human construction. Humans are putting order onto it, right? And it's not an easy point to get around, but I think the best way to do it is you can think of a courtroom, right? So, if there is no truth, there's nothing left but power. So think of a courtroom, right? You know, someone's on trial, and the two attorneys are going back and forth. And there's two ways you can look at that, and it's probably somewhere in between. The one way you can look at it is they say they're looking for the truth of what happened. They're not imposing their own set of rules upon it, but they're looking beyond themselves and saying, did he actually kill them? And they're using their linguistic capacity to bring that reality into being. But then there's another way you can look at it, and this is the nominalist claim. And more specifically, it's the postmodern claim. It's that they're just speaking from power. They're imposing their own way of looking at it onto the situation. And I think that's a good analogy because both are true. Like, to some degree, are the lawyers talking about truth? Obviously, it varies case by case, quite literally. Yes. But also, are they imposing their own reality? Yes. What does this mean? Words can be used to tell the truth, but words can also be used to not represent reality, which is to lie. But think about it like this. Because the postmodernist doesn't believe truth is a category, they don't think that there is a divine order to the world that truth speaks to. It's just something that we're imposing. They don't believe in the category of the lie. So, Jacques Derrida invents this very brilliant term, and it's différance. And what he does is he takes the word different, and instead of spelling it different, he spells it different. And it's essentially saying, I can do with language what I wish, because it's an imposed order, différance. And actually, one thing A.C. Grayling points out is when you say the word différance, it sounds like a Frenchman saying different. So what part of what Derrida is showing there is that language is malleable, language is constructible. But différent is what Derrida used to coin the gap between what humans use language for and whatever the external world is. Now, the postmodernist doesn't really believe in the external world, and I could be taking Derrida's thought incorrectly here because he's incredibly confusing. And his writing is so esoteric, I haven't even tried to read it. But what Derrida's getting at the base level, is that to misrepresent whatever constitutes reality is dangerous. And that's what the two schools of thought agree upon. So let's review. Right? We have these two schools of thought. One of them says language is beyond itself. That language is pointing to a divine order that transcends the individual, which transcends language. And that the word, in fact, is the most basic layer of reality. And that the word came and walked among the earth. And that to tell the truth is to walk in line with it. And to tell a lie is to deviate from it. And then there's the nominalist perspective, which is that grammar is an order imposed upon our conception of reality. And that truth and falsehoods don't even exist. And you know, to wrap up Nietzsche's point, it's like, we still believe in God because we have faith in grammar. What is grammar to Nietzsche? Grammar to Nietzsche is an imposed reality. What is God to Nietzsche? God is an imposed reality that man creates. Michel Foucault is one of the most prominent postmodern thinkers. What is his claim? He says that reality at the end of the day it's power. All it is power, right? And it's because he doesn't believe in truth. He doesn't believe in a divine order. So any way that we try to understand the world is just us imposing power upon it. And that's how he gets language. So right again, I don't really know like where the line is. I think it's more toward the realist perspective. I know it's not the postmodern perspective, but the question is, to what degree is language relative and what degree is it true or universal? But here's one thing that both schools of thought agree upon, and this transitions to the next part. That when there is a gap between our words and what is the external world, we stride into a dangerous domain. And what I want to do is I want to take that in two parts. I want to take that in a psychological idea and say, what does it mean psychologically to not have your words match up with your thoughts or with reality? And then what does it mean politically? So let's start with the psychological side. There was this Turkish economist by the name of Timur Kuran who wrote a book in 1985 called Preference Falsification: Public Truths, Private Lies. And what he's trying to figure out in this book is, why do revolutions happen out of nowhere that no one expects, right? Because it's a more common phenomenon than you'd expect. And what he says is that basically what happens is, in a social environment, everyone agrees that we like certain things. But then when you step back into the private domain of conscience, people don't like it, right? So, and he's saying from that bedrock, revolutions happen. Now, what have we talked about before? Plato's idea of the city and the soul analogy. That the construction of the city and the state is symbiotic to the construction of the soul. So let's take that idea and put it in the soul. What does it mean to revolt against yourself? To tell public truths but private lies? Well, that's the domain of literature. That's what literature is exploring. It's going into the depths of the human spirit and looking at these scenarios and saying, okay, what does it look like if you're at war with yourself? And to tell a story from Derek Prince once again, he talks about how he went to another kind of native cannibalistic nation and he was trying to translate the language for them. And he found that they had no distinction in their language between the heart and the voice. And because the way they saw it, there is no difference. Your voice ought to be the direct representation of what you're feeling, of what is truth. And I think the best representation of that in literature is Hamlet. Right, so what's the story of Hamlet? Hamlet essentially is given this destiny. And he wants to go act it out. He has the will to go do it. But he asks, first and foremost, very deep philosophical questions. But what Hamlet's running toward is he's saying he's at war with himself. Because outwardly, he's like, I'm not going to go kill this guy. I'm not going to go kill my uncle because he killed my dad. But inwardly, he's boiling inside with any part of him to just go kill his uncle. And he's split. And he's revolting and he's at war with himself. And what happens at the end of Hamlet? Everyone gets killed. Why? Because Hamlet can't act. And I think part of the idea there is if your psyche is so split down the middle, you can't act in this world. You have no direction. And one thing C.S. Lewis points out in the Screwtape Letters, which we've talked about both days, is that in the modern age, the gap between language and reason and what people actually want, their will, has never been so far. And what's happened there? Christianity calls it duplicity. Duplicity is when you're split down the middle and you can't follow God and you can't follow the world. So you straddle this domain in between because your heart and language aren't matching up with reality. And inevitably what happens? Everyone dies, metaphorically. And all that means is that you have no way to act. There's nothing that constitutes your ethic that tells you maybe you should go this way in life, maybe you should go that way. Because you're so split down the middle, you're at war with yourself. For instance, something that is common among revolutions, you take the French Revolution, right? Whenever a nation is at war with itself, it turns inward and it can't handle external affairs. And other nations see that and go, great, now we help overthrow them. So for instance, you take Syria, right? When there's this revolution happening, other nations come in and back them to try to overthrow the state. Well, think about that in terms of yourself. If you're at war with yourself, there's other individuals around you. You can't walk out anymore. You can't follow this path. There's nothing to guide your action. And you're putting yourself at quite a disadvantage stacked up against other individuals at that point. And the idea there is don't let your language, your words, your will become distant from the world outside. Hamlet walked down that road and it was dangerous. And James, to reference this letter again, he said, a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. Because there's nothing that bridges them together. And part of the question throughout Hamlet is Hamlet crazy? And I think that what Shakespeare understands is that to just submerge back into your unconscious and let your thoughts run wild and not manifest them in your words is to give the appearance of insanity. Because your mind is plagued by this extreme cognitive dissonance. You're a walking contradiction. So how does this apply to the state? Right? How do we extract a political ethic out of this? And I think the thinker who did the best at that was George Orwell. And George Orwell, he's probably most famous for his work 1984. But to make sense of 1984, you have to read his essay Politics in the English Language. And it's probably my favorite piece of political work that's ever been written. It's not long, it's about 12 pages. And in it, he's talking about the relationship between modern politics and modern language. And it's a wonderful essay because he's actually, the way he solves the problem is he teaches you how to write. And I was rereading it last night to kind of pick up on it, and it was so convicting because he's talking about how stop talking in these abstract forms. Use your language to ground things in a concrete manner. And the last 3 days, I've stumbled through these philosophical concepts, doing the best I can to ground them in a concrete manner, but we're talking about the ultimate layer of reality here. It's not exactly a concrete question, but it's nonetheless, he's this brilliant thinker. And what he points out is that with language, political language has this trend, right? And what happens when you use political words? They become nothing but euphemisms because they have no meaning anymore. He says the words fascism, democracy, truth, justice. No one can define these terms anymore. They're nothing but saying, oh, they're good. Oh, they're bad. And his point in that is, now what does that open the door to? What happens when the words no longer mean what they're supposed to mean anymore? Because you just hear politicians throw out those words. He says anything can be justified. Because people can have anything happen, but the word that they use can just be like, oh, it's true. You think about Donald Trump, for instance, right? And he's been critiqued often because he's careless with his language, which is true, right? But politicians all over the American political spectrum are falling into this habit of just spewing out these words, right? Throwing out truth, justice. We have to do what is right. Yeah, well, define what is right. And I'm not being annoying here, but it's not self-evident what any of these words mean. And when the words don't match up, we can't have discourse anymore. Right? What Orwell points out is there's this feedback loop between thoughts and language. And if you don't have the right words to express your thought, you can't engage in dialogue. He talks about in the Principles of Newspeak, if you've ever read 1984, Newspeak is the language that the state imposes. And what they say is basically, so you could, for instance, say the word, the party is ungood. That's their language. So you could critique the party, but there isn't the language after that to articulate a case against the state. Why? Because the word of freedom now has no more meaning. This is in George Orwell's dystopia. And you can think about that like, past in our dialogue today, past own the libs, build a wall, white supremacy, right? We don't really have a lot of linguistic capacity for real dialogue. And part of that has been the development of social media, right? Because we trade long, nuanced discussions for 120-word tweets. So words are becoming drained of their meaning. And it's just become these gray areas of good and bad. And Orwell's whole point is dialogue becomes impossible. We have no means to talk if words don't match up with reality. And what that means is that we aren't able to move forward as a nation. What happens if words don't match up? We can't talk about problems anymore. What happens if we can't talk about problems anymore? We're polarized. What happens if we're polarized? We're at war with ourselves. It's the same psychological principle we talked about. Hamlet, he was split inside because his words didn't match up with reality. Right now in our political state, because the words aren't matching up with reality, we're split, we're polarized. Because no longer is language a means that we can discuss problems with each other anymore. The same problem that you face psychologically is the same problem that we're facing as a state. So how do we synthesize this? What is to be done? And I think the thinker that handled that best was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn is this, essentially there was a New York Times article published about how Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in large part, took down the Soviet Union. Which is like, if there's ever been something that's not easy to do, it's take down the Soviet Union. And he has a very interesting story. So basically, he's a member of the Communist Party. He's this total ideologue. And then he writes a letter to his friend in the army. And he makes a joke about Stalin. They find the letter, and they haul him into the gulags. He sits in the gulags for 10 years. And he's remembering, and he's noticing, and he's picking up on what he's seeing. And he comes out of there, and he writes this 3-volume, 2,700-page work, The Gulag Archipelago. And he's running from the state, and they're trying to chase him down and kill him. And finally, he comes over and takes refuge in America. And what he's trying to figure out, he said, I'm in a bad position right now sitting in this gulag. How did I get here? And he tracks it all the way back. He says, okay, well, was it Stalin? Yeah, but it was also Lenin. Well, was it Lenin? Yeah, it also goes back. And he's tracking it back and back and back. And what's his final conclusion? How did they get here? He said it wasn't corruption at the level of the state. That's the common political theory. He said it was corruption at the level of the individual that brought the communist power into being. Why was the communist power able to take power? Or the communist state able to take power? It's because individuals stopped saying what they knew to be true. They had these beliefs inside of them that they were like, wait a minute, they probably shouldn't be killing all the kulaks off right now. But they didn't speak up. Why? Because the social norms were becoming more rigid and the state was becoming more powerful. And there's this letter that you can find of Solzhenitsyn's right before, and this is before the fact. Actually, no, this was after, forgive me. And everyone's saying, how do we fight this power? What do we do? And he says, you want to know how you fight? You tell the truth. He has this brilliant quote, and he says, one man who tells the truth can bring down an entire tyranny. One man who tells the truth can bring down an entire tyranny. Why is that? Because what is telling the truth doing back in the Christian perspective? To tell the truth is to call forth the most divine order of reality into being. And the state, effectively, the communist state, was a lie. It was living a lie. There was this, probably my favorite show I've ever watched was Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, they're tracing how the nuclear reactors exploded. And finally, this guy who ends up killing himself, the show opens with him killing himself, and then they track it through. And he basically was the Soviet scientist who worked on Chernobyl, and he realized what happened. And his final lines is this. They're trying to blame him or I forget if they're trying to blame him, but they're trying to outsource the problem. They're saying it wasn't the communist fault that this happened. Why? Because the communists could do no wrong. But he says, do you want to know how this reactor explodes? Lies. Lies. Because when your external representations are not predicated upon truth, when your words are not predicated upon truth, you stumble in darkness. And that's no matter whether or not language can touch reality, if it can't, we're in danger. Like, that's all I know. In all seriousness, I don't know whether or not language can. I assume it can to a certain degree because we can tell the truth and we can lie. But if it can't, we stumble in darkness, and Solzhenitsyn knew that. So how do you put this back together? You tell the truth. And when you catch yourself submerging back into your mind and thinking, what the heck is going on? You don't stay there. You speak that out into existence. Because what you're actually doing when you're speaking is you're calling forth the word that existed before the earth was created. You're calling that forth into being. And that is the light. You're bringing light to a situation. And yes, it's offensive. That's the problem. We're hearing, that's offensive. You can't say that. Well, of course it's offensive, dude. We're talking about the most fundamental tenet of reality. You think it's kind? We're talking about large-scale political questions. And like you look at some of Christ's messages, right? You want to know the real prosperity message? You want to know why you should follow Jesus? It's not because we can reestablish our government and our society around God. It's not because you can find a good psychological state of mind. The reason you follow Jesus is because you're a sinner headed for hell. And the truth is what sets you free. The truth that Jesus died and you can live your life out because of that. And my point is, that's not a comforting message. By the way, buddy, you keep living your life the way you're living it, you're going to end up in hell for all eternity. Well, that's offensive. Like, no one wants to hear that. And day in and day out, part of the Christian message is, by the way, keep on living your life like this. Look where you'll end up for eternity. Nietzsche himself said, all truths are bloody truths. So the ethic that arises at the end of the day is this. We can track language through its lineage and say, all right, does it touch truth? Does it touch reality? Or is reality imposed upon by humans? That's not the question we're answering today. But we do know this. If there becomes a gap between your words and what is true, we are in danger. And in that gap, that's where lies exist. That's where tyrannical powers come into being. That's where you're not able to act. So now, as we finish up language, what I want to do is I want to take this time to synthesize. You guys have been with me for 3 days now, hopefully, watching this and listening, but I want to tie all these ideas together. So let's start with a story. Actually, no, we're not going to start with a story. We'll end with a story. Leo Strauss wrote an essay. He's a 20th century political philosopher. And he's saying the West is in trouble right now. We're not in a good place. And the question he asks is, okay, do we progress? Do we find new ideas, or do we return? Is there wisdom in the past? And we talked about this a little bit toward the end of yesterday. And what he does is he explores the Jewish idea of repentance. And so repentance comes to this ethic that goes out through the Old Testament. And to repent is to turn around. Why are you turning around when you're repenting? What's good that you left? The good thing that you left, this ties into what we just talked about, is that divine order of reality, by the way. That's the truth. So God comes to his people, and he says, hey, here's my law. You live your life upon this truth, you'll do good. Okay, thank you, God. So they follow the truth, and Israel starts doing really good. And then Israel becomes prominent, and they become complacent, and they forget. They forget what made them great was the law. So they say, yeah, we can do it on our own. They collapse. They go into slavery, exile. They get ripped apart. But what happens each time? A prophet comes up. A prophet comes up and says, hey, you guys might want to stop doing what you're doing, or we're going to get wiped off the face of the earth like our ancestors. And they say, oh, thank you very much. We're good. And then sure enough, what happens? Chaos. They go into slavery, tyranny. And then God brings them out. And then it happens again. He says, hey, remember my law I gave you way back then? How about you try living your life upon this? And they say, okay, good. They live upon the law. They become good again. They collapse. And right before a prophet says, hey, remember what happened last time? Like, remember we kind of fell apart? And they say, thank you so much, we're good. And this happens 6 times throughout the Old Testament. And each time, God sends a prophet to come, revivify the message of old for the time at hand. And so that right there is what I want to discuss as we conclude. The prophet archetype. The prophet archetype is what synthesizes all we've been talking about for the last 3 days. So let's start with the individual, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to synthesize these ideas in a political manner and in a psychological manner. And if you've been listening to me talk at all for the last 3 days, you'll notice there's a subplot that I try to think on. And I think that Plato was dead on when he said that there's an analogy between the city and the soul, that they're directly correlated. So what I want to do in this manner is say, okay, how do we politically get free speech? And then what is your responsibility because of that? So let's start with the individual. What's the political idea that we get from the individual? It's placing metaphysical primacy on the individual. When God established the 2 domains, giving to Caesar what is Caesar and giving to God what is God's, what he says is there's a ring around the individual that the state can't touch. And that's why we have a Bill of Rights. We have a Bill of Rights because essentially the government can't go past that. You have the freedom to speak because you're an individual. But what's the responsibility tied with that? You walk the line between the wisdom of the past and the problems of the future. There's wisdom of the past, yes, but to live in time is to change. Just like Leo Strauss said, the prophet that comes up, what does the prophet say? Hey man, there's wisdom back here that we might want to use. but he synthesizes it with the modern problems. That's your responsibility. Your responsibility is to become an expert in what we've learned in accumulated human wisdom, and then give it to the modern people and tell the truth. Sorry, we're not going to tell the truth yet. That's for day 2. So now day 2. What is the political significance of truth, right? What does truth do? We discussed this on day 2. It gives us qualitative distinctions. I gave the example of Luke, right? I picked Luke to film this for me. Why? Because Luke is the best person that I know for this role. There's a qualitative distinction between Luke and all the other 500 people or so I could have asked. In the same way, when we're having dialogue as a nation, what we're doing is we're saying, what is the best road of action? Right? That's the end goal of free speech. It's truth. We're going to find what the truth is, because if we live our life upon truth, we won't stumble around in darkness. If we structure our state upon what made it great, then we can live in line in light and not in the darkness. But what's the individual responsibility tied in with truth? First off, you sit your whole life upon it. I gave the example of the chair. And you know that it's something that is beyond you. Right? Your whole life is predicated upon truth. And finally is the point with language. What's the political obligation with language? Language is what allows us to come together and speak. Because the alternative to language is violence. It's revolution, it's polarization. If what is true no longer matches what we speak, we draw apart because we can no longer discuss things. And then what's the psychological responsibility with language? It's what Solzhenitsyn says. It's tell the truth. Speak the truth because you don't know. Maybe you speaking the truth is what stops the next tyranny from coming into power. I want to finish with a story that I heard from Ravi Zacharias. And so Ravi's in Columbus, Ohio at the time, and he comes to the Wixon Center for the Arts. And he's given a tour, and the gentleman says, this is the first piece of postmodern architecture. He's thinking, what's that mean? And basically the architect said, there is no truth, there's no right and wrong, life has no meaning. So why should our buildings? And it's logical. It's not a good idea, but it's logical. And Ravi's response is, how'd they build the foundation? And it's because you can tinker with the top. We might have these more secular ideals prevailing on the level of analysis that we can see in rational discussion. But through the last 3 days, what have we done? We've gone deeper than that. We've gone to the foundation. And I'll tell you this, that even if the top becomes convoluted with lies, the foundation is built upon truth. The foundation is established upon a divine order. So what is your job out of this? You're the prophet archetype. The state's becoming rigid. It's becoming corrupt. We forgot what's made us great. So what do? You act out as an individual against the crowd. You use language to speak the truth, right? It's essentially, the more I articulate it, the more I'm like, this is somewhat akin to Jordan Peterson's message, except he has a secularized version of it. So on that note, I think we can conclude knowing that we established the foundational pillar of the individual, of truth, of language, and they all spin together in a psychological and political context to give us the prophet archetype. And no matter how much we're losing battles, from what we can see, there's a deeper order going on that we're calling forth. There's a deeper order that can't be tinkered with. And as long as that order stays, we'll get through this. So I want to thank you all for taking part in this journey. Thank you to Luke for being so willing to film. Thank you for my friend Colin's been here day in and day out, telling me how wrong I am, telling me how dumb my ideas are. Couldn't have done without it. My parents have been here as well, all the people who've watched, and the church for letting me use it. So thank you guys so much.